They didn't announce it. There was no podium, no statement, no carefully worded palace release. But something changed, quietly, and within minutes, people who rarely react emotionally were suddenly very still. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What happens when a message isn't meant to comfort, but to close a door? That's the question hanging over everything tonight. And it matters now. Not years from now, not in history books, because this didn't unfold in public. It unfolded in private. And the reaction to it is already spilling into view. Here's what makes this different. For months, the world has been told to watch updates, read between the lines, speculate. Health briefings carefully paced. Appearances reduced. Language softened. But behind the scenes, something far more definitive was put into motion. Not a speech. Not a reconciliation. A message. Singular. Deliberate. Final in tone, even if not in words. And when that message reached Meghan Markle, the reaction wasn't strategic. It wasn't polished. It wasn't even fully controlled. People close to the situation describe a moment of disbelief first. That pause where you reread something, not because you don't understand it, but because you don't want to accept what it implies. And then came the realization that this wasn't an opening. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even a warning. It was a boundary. This is where the story stops being about health updates and starts being about power, timing, and something far more uncomfortable, finality. Because when someone who has always been careful with words suddenly chooses fewer of them, it usually means they're done negotiating. Ask yourself this, and be honest. How do you react when you realize the conversation you've been preparing for isn't coming? What makes this moment so volatile is not what was said, but what was no longer offered. No room for reinterpretation. No future framing. No, we'll talk later. And for someone whose public life has revolved around shaping narratives, that absence can feel like a kind of erasure. This isn't about forgiveness. And it isn't about revenge either. It's about control. Who has it? Who's losing it? And who understands that time has quietly shifted the balance? Sources suggest the message was brief, almost restrained, which, oddly, made it heavier. Because when emotion disappears from language at moments like this, it doesn't mean there's nothing left to feel. It means decisions have already been made. And here's the part most people are missing. This wasn't leaked in the traditional sense. No document surfaced. No quote went viral. The impact showed up in reactions, in sudden phone calls, in changed tones, in doors that stopped opening as easily as they did before. The fallout wasn't loud. It was procedural. That's why the response mattered so much. Because while Meghan was still processing what the message meant, others had already moved past interpretation and into action. Quietly. Efficiently, without needing to explain themselves. And if you're wondering whether this message was meant to be seen someday, that's the wrong question. The real question is who it was meant for, and who was never supposed to hear it at all. Because what came next didn't happen on camera. It happened behind closed doors. And once you understand who already knew, and why, this story takes a very different turn. Who was the message really meant for? That question started circulating almost immediately. Not among commentators or tabloids, but among aides, advisors, and people who understand how these things usually work. Because messages like this don't just appear. They move, quietly, along channels most people never see. And the first thing that stood out wasn't the content. It was the route. This wasn't a broad communication. It wasn't filtered through multiple layers. It didn't pass through the usual buffers designed to soften language or create deniability. It went where it was intended to go. Direct, spare, and deliberately limited, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. When a message is carefully restricted, it's often because the sender wants absolute clarity and no witnesses. Those familiar with the palace's internal rhythms say this immediately set off alarms. Not panic, not chaos, something colder. Because when protocol is bypassed, it usually means protocol is no longer the priority. Think about that for a moment. For years, every word connected to this family has been weighed, reviewed, adjusted. Even silences have been choreographed. So when something arrives that doesn't feel choreographed at all, that feels resolved, people notice. And that's when the second detail began to surface. The message wasn't emotional. No grand reflections. No revisiting the past. No softening phrases that invite interpretation. In fact, Its restraint is what gave it weight. It read less like a farewell and more like a line being drawn, not in anger, but in certainty. One source described it this way: it wasn't written for a reaction. It was written to end something. Now ask yourself, if you're on the receiving end of that, how do you respond? Especially if you've built your public life around the belief that every story can still be shaped. The reaction, we're told, wasn't immediate. There was a pause, a recalibration, the kind of moment where someone realizes the ground has shifted but hasn't yet figured out how far. And that's when the emotional contradiction set in. Because publicly, everything remained calm, normal, even. But privately, something cracked. Those close to Meghan Markle describe a sudden sense of being excluded. Not rejected, excluded. As if a decision had already been finalized elsewhere, without consultation, without leverage, without the option to intervene. That distinction matters. Rejection invites response. Exclusion removes it. And here's where timing becomes impossible to ignore. This message didn't arrive during a moment of strength. It arrived as King Charles III's condition has reportedly worsened. When time itself becomes the deciding factor, and patience for unresolved conflicts disappears. Which leads to the question no one wants to ask out loud. If this wasn't meant to reopen anything, then what was it closing? Because while one side was still trying to understand what had just been taken off the table, others had already moved ahead, quietly adjusting access, language, and expectations as if the outcome were already known. And once that realization set in, the reaction stopped being emotional. It became urgent. Because when you finally understand that the message wasn't meant to be heard by everyone, only by the person who needed to hear it most, you also realize something else. Someone else had already heard it first. And that's where this story stops being about a message and starts being about who knew and when. Why didn't she see it coming? That's the question still echoing in private circles. Not shouted, not mocked, whispered. The kind of question that stings more because no one's asking it to accuse, they're asking it to understand. And that makes it worse. Because when the writing is on the wall and someone still misses it, the silence afterward isn't sympathy. It's distance. The truth is, when Meghan Markle received the message, she wasn't the first to know, not by a long shot. She may not even have been in the first 5. And it's that realization, more than the message itself, that seemed to send everything sideways. See, there's a fundamental difference between being informed and being included. And according to multiple sources, this message wasn't dispatched in real time. It had already made its rounds. Not widely, not recklessly, but selectively, deliberately, and in complete silence. That alone tells you everything. This wasn't about informing the public. It wasn't about drama or distraction. It was about internal clarity, settling things quietly before the noise inevitably returned. And when Meghan found out how many others had already seen it, reacted to it, even acted on it, something cracked. Not in the sense of outrage. That came later. First came a kind of panic. A subtle, spiraling sense that she had been left out of a loop she didn't even know existed. That's a uniquely disorienting kind of betrayal. When the world is still turning, and you realize it's doing so without you. And it wasn't just palace insiders who'd been looped in. It was certain royals, certain staff, trusted intermediaries, people who've kept their distance publicly but remain very much connected behind the scenes. And when Meghan discovered that a few of those individuals had responded, some with a nod, others with quiet action, the shape of the message changed entirely. It wasn't just final. It had been final for a while. She just didn't know it. That changes everything. It reframes the entire past few weeks. Because if you believe you still have room to negotiate, to reframe the narrative, to maneuver, and then realize the window's already shut, that's not just a loss. That's humiliation. People describe her reaction in that moment as fractured, a word that doesn't imply fury, but collapse. An emotional short circuit, where the mind's still trying to process and salvage, but the gut already knows. The game is over. What followed, we're told, wasn't an outburst. It was movement. Frantic, fast, unfocused. Calls made. Demands issued. But not from a place of strength. From the sinking realization that she was already steps behind, grasping for access that had quietly been pulled away days earlier. The doors hadn't slammed shut. That would have made noise. They'd just stopped opening. And by the time she realized which doors those were, One figure in particular had already made a decision that would end any remaining speculation, not just about the message, but about the future of this entire arrangement. A decision that would redefine what royal ties even meant anymore. And that decision? It wasn't broadcast. It wasn't even written down. But when the palace moved, it moved without saying a word. Some moves are louder when nothing is said. That's how one longtime palace insider described what happened next. Not in public, not in press releases, but behind curtains, within the rhythm of a machine that never stops, even when its figurehead is fighting for time. Because the monarchy doesn't wait for reactions. It adapts. Quickly, quietly, and when needed, without a trace of warmth. Here's what we know. In the days following Meghan's emotional response to the message, after the frantic calls, after the sharp pivot to damage control, something began to shift. Not overtly. No formal banishments. No declarations. But inside the institution, subtle changes were already underway. Sources describe a recalibration of protocols. Invitations that would have been automatic suddenly paused. Communications channels that once stayed open now routed differently. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. That's what makes it brutal. Because when protocol replaces personal ties, it means the decision isn't about emotion anymore. It's about positioning. Final moves. Quiet conclusions drawn behind oak-paneled doors. And remember, no one from the palace publicly acknowledged any of this. They didn't have to. Their silence was the message. You see, the monarchy doesn't respond in the way most people expect. It doesn't lash out. It doesn't retaliate. It simply rewrites access, redraws the map, and lets others discover they're no longer on it. That's exactly what began to happen. Contacts stopped replying. Names were left off distribution lists. People who once acted as intermediaries suddenly stopped taking meetings. And those few who were still in touch, they weren't offering updates. They were issuing reminders. This is no longer your lane. It was strategic exclusion. And for Meghan, someone who has operated with precision, control, and a deep understanding of narrative, that exclusion landed like a blow. Because once you're outside the room, it doesn't matter what version of the story you're telling. Inside is where the decisions are made. And here's where irony bites down. The very institution that had once been accused of rigidity, of staying silent in the face of chaos, was now using that silence as a scalpel. Not to punish, but to remove. And the message was clear. The palace had moved on. That decision wasn't broadcast. It wasn't tweeted or posted. But its consequences started showing up in ways no press team could spin. Canceled appearances, adjusted documents, titles referred to in past tense. It's what one advisor reportedly called preparations for post-Charles protocol. The painful stuff. The succession mechanics. The transition logistics that no one wants to talk about until they have to. And Meghan? She had been completely cut out of those conversations. Not in anger, in indifference. Because the final message had already done what it was designed to do. Signal the end of negotiation. But what came next wasn't silence. It was a leak. And not just any leak. One that would rip the curtain back on something even more personal. What kind of leak comes after silence? Not the kind people expect. Not a tabloid headline or a salacious whisper. This one was quieter. More surgical. It didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with timing. And that made it all the more devastating. Because just as Meghan began recalibrating, reaching out, attempting to reassert some narrative control, something slipped. A detail that hadn't been mentioned publicly. A single sentence tucked inside a private email thread that wasn't supposed to reach the outside. But it did. And it confirmed what had only been guessed at until now. King Charles's message had contained a clause. One not shared with the press, not spoken about in the family's briefings, but understood instantly by those who saw it. It was about legacy, not forgiveness, not warmth. Just a line, written with finality, excluding specific names from future acknowledgments related to succession, transition, or ceremonial remembrance. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even detailed. But its implications? They landed like a brick. And here's where the emotional weight truly shifted. Because this wasn't about being snubbed from a public event. This was about being deliberately removed from the internal record. The quiet, sacred scaffolding that defines how the crown moves forward, who is mentioned, who is recognized, and who is erased. That's what made Meghan's reaction different this time. Sources say it was no longer just about reputation or headlines. It was grief. Not over Charles himself, necessarily, but over the slow, undeniable collapse of any remaining ties to the institution. One insider described it as the final silence. Not a scream, not a door slam, just the absence of any acknowledgement that you were ever in the room. For someone who had once stood on palace balconies, smiled in official portraits, and walked beside the man now fighting cancer, that absence struck deeper than any insult ever could. But the leak didn't stop there. It included something else, a timestamp, proof that this message, had been circulated days before Meghan even received it, which meant the decision to delay her notification wasn't an accident.